everyone. We're delighted that you're here. Thank you for your patience as, you know, we've worked through this kind of automated ticket thing. Bernie's on his way. He'll be here about 7:20. And we thought that before we started the program, Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman is here, that we would do an informal Q&A. Dave, we're delighted that you're here. We're so delighted to have a progressive lieutenant governor. And rather than any other filler program, what could be better than having some Q&A with the lieutenant governor? So without further ado.
Well, thank you, and it's an honor to be here in this incredible, esteemed hall with so much rich history, and to be celebrating labor history, and not just our history, but our future together, and how we are going to continue to work and win battles for working people throughout this state and throughout this country. Thank you. I'm sure I'm not the only one in this room who daily wakes up wondering in what way we are going to get bludgeoned by Washington. What rhetoric, what hate, what misogyny, what division, what challenge to each and every one of our civil rights and collective rights as citizens of this state, this country, and this planet. But at the same time, we have to look around this room, we have to look around on January 21st when 4 million people around the world in groups of 3, 5, 20,000 in Montpelier, hundreds of thousands in major cities in this country and around the world, nearly 1 million or around 1 million in Washington, came together and said, we are going to stand together, we are going to fight against this tyranny, and we are going to do it one step at a time, one march at a time, one vote at a time, one time with our dollars, spending it on our neighbors' work, and we're going to hold each other up together. And that is the one thing that I saw come out of this election that said, you know what? It's a wake-up call. And we're waking up. And this election was a wake-up call not only for a lot of everyday working people that democracy is not a spectator sport. It's a participatory sport. It's a sport where if we weekly recognize that we can find time to jog twice a week, or have book club, or poker night, or watch a couple football games or baseball games, we can probably budget half an hour a week. This is my speech to everyday people. For you all, it's like you can find 5 hours a week to organize, to work the phones, and to participate in democracy beyond the act of voting. And I'll tell you, people are making those phone calls. The fact that the Affordable Care Act repeal got defeated in Washington didn't just happen because Washington decided to change its mind. It happened because of people like you picking up the phone. People like you in rural, working class parts of this country that got duped by the rhetoric of this president, didn't really understand that the Affordable Care Act actually was their health care plan because they had been duped into racistly calling it Obamacare, and they didn't like him, and therefore they didn't like it, without realizing that in fact it was the health care that they all of a sudden had for their chronic illness, and that it was about to get taken away. And truth does matter. And as the facts come out, people are rising up. And we have an incredible opportunity now, here particularly in this state, but across the country, to refocus the debate, refocus the discussion, because as the truth trickles down, we are going to bubble up and start to make a difference. And I'll tell you what, it is happening. But here's where I'm actually a little disheartened. I'm disheartened that here, in the state of Bernie, right? At the first speech I gave when I got sworn in as lieutenant governor, and I all of a sudden realized I had to give a speech. I said, I did think about it a little bit, but I thought, you know, we have the opportunity as the land of Bernie, the land that the rest of this country used to look at going, you know, Vermont, where's that, who is that, whatnot. And then now they're going, holy, there's some children in the room, right? They were looking at Bernie and going, what is in the water over there? What is it all about? And Bernie inspired millions, over 13 million people against all odds to vote for him. And my little caveat, but for, and I like these people, but for Elizabeth Warren and Sherrod Brown not endorsing Bernie in those respective states, I think we would be in a very different place today. And I think it's really, thank you. That momentum was so close that just those two states, and frankly, if Ohio went with Sherrod Brown's support, I suspect Missouri with 1,500 votes would have gone our way too. That's how close we were. But the thing is, here in Vermont, we're not that close. We're well beyond. 86% in the primary for Bernie. And it's across many, many parties of individual support that support the basic concepts of economic justice, environmental justice, and social justice. And we are fortunate that we are thinking in these ways when so many other folks are still just fighting for some of the most basic rights. But in my speech in January, I said we could be a beacon for this country. We could pass the policies that would be for working people, for the fight for 15, for universal health care, for affordable housing, for clean water, and on, criminal justice reform. And there's more. I could go on and on. But we haven't really done it. We have struggled. I don't know about you, if you're sitting there going, hey, Montpelier, you did such a great job of being the land of Bernie. Who here feels that way right now? I kind of feel the same way. There is some progress. There's some criminal justice reform bills that I think are going to get through on profiling, which I think are really important. But minimum wage, we're setting the table for next year. You know, affordable housing, we didn't even end up voting on it. But Senator Michael Sirotkin, someone who's lobbied and championed for labor for 25 years in the State House, now a senator from Chittenden County, we were going to lose the amendment that he was going to offer for literally 35 cents on a room rental. And yes, working class people also use campgrounds, and it would have been a pinch, but 35 cents a night would have raised enough money to bond for $30 million that with Vermont Housing Conservation Board and other investors would have leveraged a total of $100 million to be invested in affordable housing. 35 cents a night. Well, it didn't even get voted on, and she said that went down. It didn't even get voted on, and on top of that, 90% of the $100,000 that would have raised is paid by out-of-staters. So for $100,000 of Vermonters' money, we could have leveraged a $100 million investment in affordable housing, and we didn't even have a vote on that. So the question was why? So that's a complicated question for just 3 letters. I would say there's 2 or 3 reasons why a lot of things haven't happened this year. One is we have a governor, and we're kind of in home turf here in the town of Barre, but we have a governor who I think in some ways was a reluctant candidate, and in the end is a somewhat reluctant governor because he doesn't actually have a firm political and social ideology. He's got a general ideology of things are tough and we need to make things better. That's not really an ideology. That's sort of a rhetorical concept. And so when it comes to actually serving in the role of being governor, where you are the de facto leader of the state, and you can be proposing ideas that are going to actually have profound impacts on people's lives day in and day out in the future, if you don't have an ideology and a direction that you want to go, it's very hard to be a leader. Most people don't follow a sort of aimless leader, right? They want someone who's got some core values that they're going to fight for. And people want to see that fight. And part of that fight and that ideology is we will not raise any new money for anything. And with new leadership in the House, and frankly the House is more conservative than it's been in most of the time that I served in the House and Senate of 18 of the last 20 years. It's turned out that the Senate is actually almost more forward-thinking than the House, which used to be kind of the opposite. And so with new leadership in both bodies and the governor's office and my office, it's been tough to build that momentum and tough to get the votes out of the House in particular. They did finally vote out a fairly watered-down paid family leave bill. At first, it would have generated one of the most generous family packages in the country. We talk about wanting to attract family-age people, people with children, move to Vermont. Well, one way to do that is to say, guess what? We have real family values, which is when you have a child, you actually get to stay with that child for 12 whole weeks, which is actually a pretty short period of time, but it's a whole lot better than anywhere else in the country, with 100% of your pay for that time. And he said, nope, too expensive, and certainly businesses can't pay any. So first, businesses got cut out, so it was all on the workers' backs. Still was, frankly, a step in the right direction. If you're a minimum wage worker, would you pay $4 a week to have a $5,000 insurance if you had a kid, that you would get paid to be home with your kid? I still think that's pretty good. But it wasn't talked about that way. It was talked about as a $93 million cost, and that's a big, scary number, not $4 a week or $8 a week if you're making $20 an hour. So it shoved into committee, and finally they voted it out the other day. It's now 6 weeks at 80% of your pay for child or parent, not other family members. So it got whittled down, and now it's coming across. I don't know if we're going to get it across the finish line because we only have a week left. But that's what keeps happening is a bold idea gets presented. See, it's a complicated answer to why. But a bold idea gets presented, and the person up here says, no way. And instead of the backing that we need all of you to do for those reps and senators to say, we got your back, do it, they quickly shirk back, and they're nervous, and they're not willing to do it. And minimum wage, there was discussion about the benefits cliff. As I say, well, you passed the minimum wage, because that's a 4- and 5-, 6-year implementation that steps every year. And if we got to address the benefits cliff, well, that's 2 committees, full-time work next year. You know, set the table, make them do the work. Don't say, well, we're not even going to give people a raise till we get the work done. Seems a little backwards. Let's force the work on ourselves, and while we're at it, get people a raise. You know, and in fact, a 50 cents an hour minimum wage is $1,000 a year in someone's pocket. And so even if it was $4 a week or $200 a year for paid family leave, if you have $1,000 more and you got to pay $200 more to have paid family leave insurance, the math's not that hard. You still have $800 more. Why we don't present those 2 bills together and say, we are making you better off. I'm not sure why we're afraid to do it. I'm not afraid to do it. Are you afraid to do it? No. So it's, but it takes that activism. How many people here on some issue have called their legislator in the last 2 weeks? Yeah, I say 2 weeks, that's right. And there's a reason for that. Okay, how many in the last month? How many this session? It's still barely half. 15 minutes a week. We defeated the Affordable Care Act in Washington because our brothers and sisters in other states called their senators. But you're relying on your legislators here to have the courage to do the right thing. without you holding firm on their back, giving them that support so they can stand up straight and do the right thing. So what I've been doing is going around the state talking to high school groups, saying, you know what? You can't vote yet, but you're going to be voting the next year or two, and you have a voice just like anybody else, and you have a right to use it. Make those phone calls. I've talked to groups like this and others and said, same question, 15 minutes a week, half an hour a month. Make those couple of calls. And so that's what we need to do, is build the movement to give the people in Montpelier the backing and the support so that we can set the example and show the rest of this country what Vermont is all about, so that the ideas of our highly esteemed, incredibly supported in this room, U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders is talking about in Washington, D.C. Now, that wasn't quite the full introduction I was going to give. So you're going to get to clap for him again. But I have to say, Bernie Sanders was as young as I am in 1992 when I first learned about him as a student at the University of Vermont. And I was pretty darn cynical about the two-party system and the corporate interests that dominated our political system. I was an activist on environmental issues, wanted to save the world. And it was Bernie who inspired me as someone who wore his politics straight on his sleeve, who had an ideology, which I believe we were talking about someone else lacking one earlier. I think it's night and day between those two people, and presented it clearly in a message everyone could understand. And he eschewed corporate money in politics. And he said, I'm here for the people. Democracy, demos, people. And he inspired me to get involved in politics. And here we are 20-odd years later, and I'm your lieutenant governor, and this guy has inspired the nation about what civil, positive politics can be about. And that if you stand up and you fight for working people and the rights of folks to have a decent home over their heads and health care and a basic standard of living that in the richest country in the world every single person should have, you will resonate with people across all kinds of short-term rhetorical ideologies and delve right into those basic fundamental needs that everybody wants, which is a healthy future for themselves and their family and their community. And I am so honored that Bernie represents us in Washington, and that after an incredibly long day, this guy works so hard, gets back up here, gets in the car, gets down here today. He's going to get down here again tomorrow for the climate march. I don't know where he gets the energy, but he inspires me every day. I know he inspires you. And please welcome our Senator Bernie Sanders.
David, thank you very much for that introduction. My voice is a little bit hoarse. It's because I've been running all over the country, trying to get people involved in the political process, and we're having some success. Let me thank Ruth Ruttenberg, President of the Historical Society, Karen Lane, and the late Chet Briggs for their committed efforts over the years to restore this very, very beautiful hall. And I'd like to thank the Barre Historical Society for sponsoring this event. And while many people worked very hard to pull this evening together, let me personally thank a few by name, including my good friend, my old friend, Marge Powers. Where's Marge? There she is. It is an honor. It's not the first time, obviously, that I've been here, but it is sends a few chills up our backs when we know that Eugene Victor Debs spoke here among many others. And it's, I want to thank anybody and everybody who called this evening from Debs to Sanders. I certainly don't deserve that, because Debs will go down in history as one of the great political leaders of this nation.
So will you.
Today we commemorate Primo Maggio, May Day, International Workers' Day. This is a day when we recognize the struggles of working people all across our country and all across the globe. And just having returned from Washington, D.C. this afternoon, I cannot express to you how important it is that that concept of worker solidarity be revived again, not just in this country, but all over the world. There's nothing more important. And as we participate in this event here at the Labor Hall, it is a day to remember all of those who sacrificed, struggling not just for workers' rights, but struggling for human rights. We think back throughout the history of this country, and we can envision in our minds people on picket lines, fighting for justice at the workplace, fighting for women's rights, fighting for civil rights, fighting for environmental rights. And many of those victories we kind of take for granted today, although needless to say, President Trump is reminding us, I think, every moment about how hard we are going to have to fight to retain the great victories won by so many people for so many years. We take for granted the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, safety protections, the minimum wage, unemployment insurance, Social Security, overtime compensation, and so much more. As Frederick Douglass, another great American, reminded us, nothing is ever given. Freedom is never given. It always has to be struggled for. That's what Frederick Douglass knew, and that is what Eugene V. Debs knew as well. And having just returned from Washington this afternoon, where we have a president and a Republican leadership who want to give hundreds of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the top 0.2%, while at the same time cutting back on desperately needed programs for working people, for children, for the elderly, for the sick, and for the poor. Trust me, that struggle for dignity, that struggle for workers' rights, that struggle continues today and in fact must be intensified. I was recently reminded that this hall was built, when this hall was built, almost 90% of Barre's workers were unionized. There were 15 separate locals. That was then. We live in a different world today. Tonight's event has been called the From Debs to Sanders Fighting for Change. But of course, the struggle began long before Debs, and it will go on long after me. And let me say just a few words about Eugene Victor Debs, who was and is a personal hero of mine, somebody I consider to be one of the outstanding political leaders in the history of this country. Debs devoted his entire life to the struggles of working people, and he paid a price for that. As I think all of you know, his last campaign for president took place with him sitting in jail. And he sat in jail because he had the courage to oppose World War I. And he was also jailed for helping to organize major strikes. As an organizer in the railroad industry and later as presidential candidate, Debs saw the incredible suffering caused by a broken, immoral, and unjust economic system. During his day, he saw children working 14 hours a day in factories, in sweatshops, and in fields alongside of their parents who were trying to survive on subsistence wages. He saw lumbermen and farm workers laboring under slave-like conditions and miners working from sunrise to sunset in dangerous coal mines. He saw the plight of African Americans, including the many sharecroppers in the South, and with incredible courage, developed an alliance between working peoples across race lines, not something that was easily done in the early part of the 20th century. He saw politicians and judges bought and sold by John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Corporation, the big banks, and the railroad tycoons like Jay Gould, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and Edward Harriman. He saw a war fought, World War I, where millions of workers throughout Europe died fighting each other with a barbarity that had never been seen before. On a given day, tens of thousands of people slaughtered each other. And nobody quite knew the reason why, but they surely died fighting for the Kaiser, they died fighting for the Tsar, they died fighting for the King of England or some other autocrats. Debs opposed that war, and he went to jail as a result. And in fact, as I mentioned, he ran his last campaign for president from a jail cell. And while that war was supposedly being fought for freedom, aren't all wars always fought for freedom, he saw Socialist Party headquarters ransacked during that period, and the Socialist Party virtually unable to publish its newspapers or communicate with its members. Not only was Debs a vigorous fighter for workers' rights, he was, very importantly, an internationalist. He stood with working people in every country. His goal was to create a world without war and create a rational economy that worked for all people, not just a handful of wealthy and powerful captains of industry. In other words, he envisioned a very, very different kind of world, both here in the United States and globally. At a time when the richest 1% of this world today own more wealth than the bottom 99%. Let me repeat that. Today, globally, the richest 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 99%. And in country after country all over the world, including the United States, we are seeing more and more concentration of wealth and income, not just in America, but all over the world. Handful of people dominate national economies from one end of this world to the other. At a time when a handful of giant banks control much of the world's economy, we remember that we are one world. So what Debs talked about was bringing people all over the world together. That was true then. It is even truer today. At a time when a handful of media conglomerates, you think Rupert Murdoch has power only in the United States of America? He is all over the world. We remember that we are one world. At a time when the entire planet is threatened by the greed and irresponsibility of the fossil fuel industry, and every person on earth, especially the poorest, are threatened by climate change, it's important that we never forget that we are one planet, one world, one humanity. And literally tomorrow, in Washington, in Montpelier, and in communities throughout this country and throughout the world, that point will be forcefully made. This planet does not survive unless we have the courage to take on the fossil fuel industry and their greed and to transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. And I'll just give you an example, if I might. Last week, when I still had my voice, I was in Florida, I was in Nevada, and I was in Arizona. Now you think if you go to Florida, Nevada, and Arizona, you're going to see a hell of a lot of solar panels, won't you? Florida, after all, is called the Sun State. There are not many. We in Vermont are doing much better than they are in their states. Do you know why? Anyone know why? Because the fossil fuel industry has successfully put a lot of pressure on their state governments, making it very, very hard for people to install solar. So if you can believe it, at a time when we are fighting for the planet, you have a president who denies the reality of climate change. You got a fossil fuel industry who is trying to get every last dime they can out of oil and gas and coal, and not worried about the kind of planet our children, grandchildren, or future generations will be living in. Now, another point to be understood about Debs. Debs never won, needless to say, a presidential election. I think he did serve one term in the Indiana State House. But he never won a presidential election. In fact, he never received more than 6% of the vote. Now, I suspect he may have. They probably did not count a lot of votes that he got. But anyhow, officially, he never received more than 6% of the vote. But because of his political work and the efforts of countless others in the labor movement, in the Socialist Party of the time, the American people are clearly better off today than when Debs was alive. In fact, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt's detractors will say, many of the programs adopted in the 1930s, the New Deal, were adopted straight from the Socialist Party platform. So he raised those issues, he fought for those issues, he was never able to implement those issues, but he woke up the American people to say, you know what, workers have the right to form unions. Farmers have the right to get a decent price for their crops. Women have the right to play a more active role in society. We have got to combat racism, etc., Social Security. All of those ideas emanated from the Socialist Party platform. That was then, and here we are today. And again, the importance of Debs is to understand his concept of solidarity. The fact that working people have got to come together to take on the big money interests who then and today have incredible power. And one of my frustrations is you could turn on the television, and it's not just Fox TV, any of the TV networks, until the cows come home, if I may say that. And you will hear very little discussion of what power is about. Today in Washington, under Trump, there is a massive effort to throw 24 million people off of health insurance, repeal the Affordable Care Act, cut Medicaid by $800 billion, defund Planned Parenthood, and raise premiums for older workers very substantially. Today in Washington, there is an effort led by Trump and the Republican leadership, listen to this, to provide $353 billion in tax breaks to the top 0.2%. Trump has appointed as his highest level cabinet members people who have spent their entire political lives trying to cut or privatize Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and public education. So what is going on today is a direct repudiation of everything that Debs and many other people stood for. What Debs expressed, and he was, as I understand it, there are no recordings of him, but all of the history of his time suggests that he was an extraordinary orator. And the point that he was making over and over again is that as human beings, we are entitled to rights. And those rights are not just political rights of freedom of speech or freedom of religion. They are economic rights. Economic rights. If you are a human being, you are entitled to have the right to earn a decent wage. You are entitled to have the right as a human being to have health care regardless of your income. You are entitled to get the best education you possibly can. You are entitled to breathe air that is clean and drink water that is not polluted. As human beings, we are entitled to those rights. Those were Debs' ideas, those happen to be my ideas, and I think those are the beliefs that many of you have. And they stand in direct contrast to another ideology. An ideology which says we're not all in this together through solidarity, that I have got to worry about your kids and you got to worry about my kids. But it is an ideology which says I am allowed, and Trump is the perfect example of this, to do anything I want in order to make more and more money. That the goal of life is the accumulation of billions. And I am a successful person, no matter how much I cheat, no matter how much I exploit people, no matter how much I demean people. I am successful simply because I have made a whole lot of money. And I can turn my back on people sleeping in the street, children who are hungry, older people who are scared about retirement. I don't have to worry about it. All I have to worry about is myself. We reject that philosophy. Debs rejected that philosophy. What is important? And you know, we're living in a crazy world, and we're living in a world that is changing so rapidly, that you can turn on, one of 563 channels and still not have anything meaningful to watch. But the truth is, and if you look at the major issues, and Debs ran into this problem as well, believe me, if you think we have a problem with the media today, it's not new. It existed in Debs' time as well. But just look at what is going on today. And our job is to ask the hard questions. Why is it? Here is a simple question. Tell me the last time you saw it on CBS. Everybody knows that technology is exploding. Everybody knows that every worker in this room is capable of producing a lot more than somebody who did similar work 20 or 30 years ago. That's good. Technology is good. And yet if we are seeing an explosion of technology, if people are producing more, why for the last 40 years has the middle class of this country shrunk? Why is it that in this state and throughout the country, we have people working 2 or 3 jobs, 50 or 60 hours? Why is it that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was possible for one person in a family, in those days often the man, working 40 hours a week to earn enough money to take care of the whole family? And now you have mom working, dad working, and the kids working. You have an explosion of technology, and yet those families will often have less disposable income than a family did 40 years ago. Why is that? Is anyone asking that question? Well, it's a question that has to be asked. And one of the answers has a lot to do with the fact that over the last 30 years, there has been a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class, not even to the top 1%, but to the top 1/10 of 1%. Used to be the top 1/10 of 1% about 30 years ago owned 7% of the wealth. Today, that 1/10 owns 22% of the wealth, as much as the bottom 90%. Who talks about it, who struggles about it, who raises the moral issue of one family, the Walton family in America, one family owning as much wealth as the bottom 42% of the American people. All right. And meanwhile, that same family, I might say, is the largest welfare recipient in the country. Do you know why they are the largest welfare recipient? Because they pay their workers wages that are so low that their workers are forced to go on Medicaid, food stamps, and subsidized housing. And who do you think pays for that Medicaid and food? You do. So the Walton family, I'm here to tell you, is very grateful. They are very grateful as they wait, by the way, as they await Trump's effort to repeal the estate tax and give them a $50 billion tax break. But having said that, they do appreciate your help. And anything more you can contribute would be much appreciated. The United States today, Martin Luther King talked about this, Debs talked about it. We have got to raise up as high as we can the belief that health care is a right of all people, not a privilege. And what we are competing against is the Koch brothers ideology, which says that we should not come together as a people and as a government and do important things to protect our needs. Their ideology, which is now the ideology of Trump and the Republican Party, says, you want health insurance? No problem. There is an insurance company down the block. You don't need Medicaid. You don't need Medicare. You don't need the WIC program for low-income pregnant women. You don't need public health or community health centers. If you don't have the money, we're sorry, you are on your own. Today in America, we are not living as in the kinds of straits that people lived back in the 1920s, that's for sure. But do not forget that there are 43 million Americans today living in poverty. There are single mothers who cannot find decent, affordable child care for their children. There are people today who can't put it together to put gas in the car, pay rent, pay insurance, pay for the basic necessities of life in the richest country in the history of the world. Today in America, there are communities all over this country where youth unemployment is 20, 30, or 40%, especially high in inner cities and in rural America. Maybe, just maybe, instead of having more people in jail than any other country on earth, we might just want to invest in jobs and education for our kids. We don't talk about it, but almost half of older workers in America, 55 or 60 years of age, who are going to be reaching retirement in a few years. Do you know how much money they have in the bank? Anyone know? Zero. This is the richest country in the history of the world, and about half of older workers have nothing in the bank as they head toward retirement. Last year, I was in Pine Ridge Native American Reservation, where the life expectancy is about the equivalent of Guatemala, where alcoholism is an epidemic, youth suicide extremely high. Point being that in the richest country in the history of the world today, we have inequalities that are grotesque and they are immoral. And not only are we not even dealing with that in Congress, the actions that are taken are going to make a very bad situation even worse. What Debs taught us was a very simple lesson, and that is nobody can do it by himself or herself, that we need to stand together. Yes, the other side has incredible wealth and incredible power, but when we stand together, we have even more power. So my message, I guess, to all of you tonight is that Eugene Victor Debs is long gone, dead and gone, died in 1926. But his vision of a nation in which working people had power, in which all people enjoyed a decent standard of living, in which women and minorities had full power, and we broke down those barriers. Where we would live in a world where we would eliminate war. Think what we can do. We're spending $600 billion on the military right now, $600 billion. Trump wants another $80 billion for the next 2 years. Think about what that can do in terms of providing the best quality education in the world, best child care in the world, how we can create millions of jobs cleaning up our environment, making public colleges and universities tuition-free, rebuilding our roads and our bridges and our water systems. Right? So our job is to, I think, bring forth a progressive agenda, to never forget that in Vermont and in America, there are a lot of people who are really, really hurting economically unnecessarily, because this is the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And to understand that we have got to bring peoples of the world together, that instead of war, we've got to figure out ways to end the scourge of war. Not easy. None of this stuff is easy, trust me. But that is what we have got to do. So I think today, May Day, in a few days, May Day, we are remembering the struggles of the past. We are remembering the vision of extraordinary people who tried to change the world, and our job is never to forget their vision. Don't begin to think small. Think big. Think of a new world that our kids and our grandchildren, we may not get to that world, but our children and our grandchildren may get to this world. Right now, just as one example, we are fairly close, despite all of the efforts of the fossil fuel industry. We are not far away from having universal free electricity through solar. Right? And that's just one example. There is so much that we can do to create a beautiful nation and a beautiful world. And I know it's hard to imagine that when you turn on the TV and you see the ugliness that we see. I just, this week, met some people from Syria, and describing what is going on in Syria is literally beyond belief, the horror show that is going on there, etc. But I think to honor Debs, we remember his extraordinary vision of solidarity, of a world without war. And our job is to keep fighting every single day to get closer and closer to making that vision a reality. Thank you all very much.
Welcome home, Bernie, to this House of Labor, to a house of Eugene Victor Debs, and a house now of Bernie Sanders as well. Senator Sanders said he would take a few questions. I have just a few announcements I need to make quickly. One is that in the spirit of Debs to Sanders, we want to give you this Debs to Sanders book written by a good friend of the Hall. And thank you very much. Senator Sanders.
Okay, maybe one question. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Senator Sanders, beloved brother Bernie, in this historic building where Debs and Emma Goldman and Mother Jones spoke, I'm going to ask you if you're ready to take a stand that goes to the heart of runaway inequality and climate change and call for the establishment of a Vermont state bank. David Zuckerman has taken that stand. It's in the Progressive Party platform. We need your support. I'd be interested in your opinion.
Yes. I don't want to disappoint you, but this is not a particularly radical idea. North Dakota has had it for the last, since the 1920s. I mean, and the goal here is that, a lot of money goes through Montpelier. People pay taxes, etc. And what we want to do is try to get that money, recycle that money back into the community, into decent jobs, protecting agriculture, protecting our environment. So rather than giving the money to Wall Street to do whatever they will do with it, which will in almost every instance be a negative, I do believe that we should use that money to improve life here in the state of Vermont. Okay? All right, let me just, it's been a long day and I should get back, but just want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. This is a great turnout, and to keep the vision alive. What I can tell you is, having been all over this country, our vision, more or less, people will disagree, but our vision of fighting for a nation and a government that work for all of us rather than the 1%, that is the majority view of the American people. All right, never forget that. Thank you very much.